The kitchen was the only room in the penthouse that felt remotely like hers. It was a cold, surgical space of stainless steel and German engineering, designed for a caterer, not a person. But Rose had colonized it. Jars of her own spice blends stood in defiant rows against the gray marble backsplash. A worn wooden spoon, the only thing she'd brought with her from her old life, rested on a pristine quartz countertop. In this cold, silent palace overlooking the glittering sprawl of Seoul, the scent of braising oxtail was an act of rebellion. Rose moved with an economy of motion that belied her soft, generous curves. Her hands, deft and sure, stripped thyme leaves from their stems. She was 22 years old, a wife in name only, a debt payment in flesh. Her father's business mistakes had been settled with a marriage contract, binding her to Kwon Jin-woo, a man who moved through the city's underworld like a phantom in a bespoke suit. He never ate her food. He'd made that clear the first week. A sterile tray of precisely measured protein and steamed vegetables would be delivered to his office by a silent housekeeper. He treated her presence in his home with the same detached indifference he might afford a new piece of art he hadn't chosen himself. He saw her, she knew, as a soft, useless thing. The chubby American girl his rivals could laugh about. Tonight, the silence in the penthouse was different. It was a taut, humming thing, stretched to its breaking point. Jin-woo was hosting a meeting in the main salon. She could hear the low, guttural rumble of male voices, the sharp clink of whiskey glasses. The energy seeping under the door was acrid, dangerous. Rose focused on her pot, the rich, dark gravy bubbling slowly. Comfort food. Soul food. It was the only language she had left. On an impulse she couldn't explain, part defiance, part a desperate need to do something, she ladled a small portion of the stew into a simple earthenware bowl. She added a scoop of creamy grits, a dish so out of place in this world of sharp edges and cold transactions that it felt like a prayer. She handed the bowl to one of the young guards who stood, stiff and terrified, just outside the kitchen. "For them," she said, her voice quiet. "They look hungry." The guard hesitated, his eyes wide. Taking something from her, the boss's unwanted wife, was a risk. But the smell rising from the bowl was intoxicating, a promise of warmth in a world of cold steel. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and carried it into the lion's den. Rose held her breath, listening. The angry murmur from the salon didn't stop, but its rhythm changed. There was a pause, a different kind of silence. Then a low voice, one she didn't recognize, said something that was swallowed by the thick walls. Minutes later, the guard returned, his expression unreadable. He placed the empty bowl on the counter without a word and resumed his post. The meeting ended an hour later. She heard the heavy front door close, the elevator's soft chime. The tension in the air finally dissipated, leaving behind a stale residue of cigar smoke and menace. Rose began to clean her station, her shoulders aching with a fatigue that had little to do with cooking. "You." His voice cut through the quiet hum of the ventilation fan. Kwon Jin-woo stood in the doorway of her kitchen. He was a man carved from shadow and discipline. His suit was a deep charcoal Tom Ford, fitting his broad shoulders so perfectly it seemed fused to his skin. His black hair was expertly cut, his face a mask of cold, handsome indifference. He looked at the bubbling pot on the stove, then his dark, unreadable eyes settled on her. They held no warmth, only a chilling, analytical intelligence. "What was that?" he asked. His English was perfect, unaccented. "Oxtail stew," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She refused to let him see her tremble. "With grits." He took a step into the kitchen. He moved like the room owed him space. "My guest, Mr. Park, said it reminded him of his grandmother's cooking." Rose said nothing. She just wiped down the counter with a clean cloth. "Mr. Park is a sentimental man," Jin-woo continued, his voice dangerously soft. "Sentimentality makes men careless. He was prepared to walk away from a deal that would have cost me millions. After he ate your stew, he became more agreeable." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, from her worn apron to the determined set of her jaw. It was the first time he had ever truly looked at her. "Tomorrow, you will cook for my lieutenants. All of them." It wasn't a request. It was an order, an assignment. He turned and left without another word, the sound of his expensive leather shoes fading on the marble floor. Rose stood alone in the sterile kitchen, the scent of thyme and garlic clinging to the air. She had sent a message in a bowl of stew, and the most dangerous man in Seoul had, for the first time, heard her. That was the moment everything changed. The next evening, the penthouse dining room was transformed. The long, sterile glass table was accustomed to tense negotiations and whispered threats, not the scent of roasted chicken and caramelized onions. 12 of Jinwoo's highest-ranking men sat stiffly in their chairs, their tailored suits like armor. They were soldiers, enforcers, and strategists, their faces hard, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. And they were all looking at her. Rose felt the weight of their scrutiny as she directed the staff to serve the meal. She hadn't prepared a fussy, multi-course dinner designed to impress.
She had made food meant to be eaten.
A whole roasted chicken, skin crisp and burnished to a deep gold, stuffed with lemon and herbs. Creamy mashed potatoes, rich with butter. Green beans blistered in a hot pan with garlic. A simple salad. And pans of her mother's cornbread, the aroma of which filled the room with a warmth it had never known. Jinwoo sat at the head of the table, a silent, watchful king. He didn't touch his plate, but he watched his men. He watched as his second-in-command, a brutal man named Kang, took a hesitant bite of the chicken. Kang's eyes widened slightly. He took another bite, then another. Soon, the stilted silence was broken by the sounds of eating, the scrape of forks, low murmurs of appreciation. These hardened killers were disarmed by a meal. They started calling her Mama Rose a few weeks later. It began as a joke, a nickname whispered by the younger guards. But it caught on, spreading through the ranks of Jinwoo's empire. The name carried a weight of respect, an acknowledgement of the strange power she now wielded from her kitchen. The penthouse, once a cold fortress, had become a center. Men would find excuses to come, hoping to be there when she was trying a new recipe. Her food became a currency of its own, a reward for loyalty, a comfort after a violent night. Jinwoo never acknowledged it, but he saw everything. He saw the way his men's shoulders relaxed when she entered a room. He saw the genuine smile she received, something all his money and power could not buy. He began to stay for dinner. He never complimented the food, but he cleaned his plate every time. One night, the fragile peace was shattered. A rival clan, the Choi family, grew bolder. They saw Jinwoo's consolidation of power as a threat and launched a surprise attack on one of his shipping fronts at the port. The news came via a frantic call that had Jinwoo leaving the dinner table in a blur of controlled violence. Rose spent the night listening to the frantic energy in the penthouse, the hushed, urgent phone calls, the sharp orders being given. She knew men were hurt, that blood was being shed. She felt useless, trapped. She had a clear opportunity to run. Security was focused on the crisis, the perimeter vulnerable for the first time since she'd arrived. The thought was a sharp, painful temptation. A life of her own was just a few unguarded doors away. But she thought of the young guards, of Kang's grudging respect, of the exhausted faces she knew would be returning. Instead of running to the door, she walked back into her kitchen. She pulled out the largest stockpot she had and began to make soup. A rich, restorative chicken and rice soup, simmering it for hours until the broth was liquid gold. She baked bread until 3 a.m. She made sustenance. She made comfort. It was a deliberate choice to stay, to fight her own battle with the only weapons she had. Jinwoo returned just before dawn. He was a specter of exhaustion and violence. There was a dark smudge of what could only be blood high on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were scraped raw. He walked through the penthouse, his presence silencing the frantic activity. His men parted for him, their faces a mixture of fear and reverence. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, drawn by the light and the aroma. Rose was stirring the huge pot of soup, her movements slow and weary. She didn't look up, sensing his presence. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid. He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable. The cold mask was still in place, but she could see the bone-deep fatigue in the line of his shoulders, the darkness in his eyes. This was the man behind the monster, wounded and raw. It was a glimpse of a vulnerability he would never admit to. He walked toward her, his steps silent.
He didn't speak.
He simply reached past her for a bowl. His arm brushed hers, and the contact was a jolt, a spark of heat in the cold room. She flinched, not from fear, but from the unexpected intensity of it. He ladled the soup for himself, his movements precise despite his exhaustion. He sat at the small steel prep table in the center of the kitchen and ate in silence. When he was finished, he placed the bowl quietly in the sink. He still hadn't said a word. As he turned to leave, his gaze met hers. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. She saw something in his eyes, a flicker of gratitude, of confusion, of something deeper and more dangerous. "My sister," he said, his voice a low rasp. "She used to cook for my father's men. They betrayed him. They killed her while she was trying to protect him." He didn't wait for a response. He simply walked out, leaving Rose with the ghost of his confession hanging in the steam-filled air. He had lost a woman he was meant to protect. And now, in her own way, she was protecting his men. He was beginning to see her not as a debt, but as an echo of a wound he had never allowed to heal. The Choi family, led by the cunning and ruthless Choi Min-jun, didn't relent. Having failed to cripple Jin Woo's operations at the port, they shifted their focus. They began to hear the whispers coming from inside Kwan's empire, whispers about a new center of gravity, a woman who commanded loyalty not through fear, but with food. They heard the name Mama Rose, and they identified a new weakness. Rose had earned a small measure of freedom. Once a week, escorted by two of Jin Woo's most trusted guards, she was permitted to visit a specific outdoor market to source ingredients she couldn't get from their regular suppliers: rare spices, specialty produce, fresh seafood straight from the docks. It was a calculated risk on Jin Woo's part, a concession to the influence she now held. It was on one of these trips that the Choice made their move. The market was a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds, a place where it was easy to get lost, easy for a threat to go unnoticed. As Rose was haggling with a vendor over a basket of perilla leaves, the attack came. It was brutally efficient. A van screeched to a halt, and 3 men armed with knives swarmed them. Her guards, though highly trained, were caught by surprise. Rose didn't scream. She acted. While her guards engaged the attackers, she grabbed a heavy crate of daikon radishes and hurled it at the closest man, catching him in the chest and knocking him off balance. It gave one of her guards the opening he needed. But another man was already on her, his hand grabbing her arm in a brutal grip. The cold edge of a knife pressed against her ribs. Then, everything became a blur of motion. A black sedan, seemingly appearing from nowhere, mounted the curb, its engine roaring. The driver's side door flew open and Jin Woo emerged. He was not wearing a suit jacket, just a crisp white shirt and black trousers, and he moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold. He had a gun in his hand, but he didn't fire it. The man holding Rose froze, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Jin Woo's face was a mask of cold fury unlike anything Rose had ever seen. It was not the controlled anger of a boss. It was the primal rage of a predator whose territory had been violated. "Let her go," Jin Woo said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of such deadly promise that the air itself seemed to grow cold. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on Rose. It was his last mistake. Jin Woo closed the distance between them in 2 impossibly fast strides. The butt of his gun came down in a vicious arc, shattering the man's wrist. He howled in pain, the knife clattering to the pavement. Jin Woo didn't stop. A precise, brutal sequence of strikes left the man unconscious on the ground before his partner could even react. The chaos was over in seconds. Jin Woo stood over the fallen man, his chest rising and falling. He turned to Rose, his eyes blazing. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her toward the car. He wasn't just protecting an asset. He was protecting her. The raw, possessive fury in his eyes was a confession more potent than any words. He shoved her into the back seat and got in beside her, barking orders at his driver. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline of the fight still coursing through him. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her as if checking for damage, and he saw the tear in her sleeve, where the man had grabbed her. His jaw tightened. He had almost lost her. That night, one of the captured Choi family soldiers was brought to the penthouse. He was tied to a chair in Jin-woo's office, defiant and spitting insults. Jin-woo stood before him, calm and patient, a collection of cruel-looking instruments laid out on his desk. Rose watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. She was supposed to be afraid, horrified, but all she felt was a cold, simmering anger. They had tried to take her. They had tried to use her to hurt him. She noticed the man's dialect, a subtle accent from the southern coast. She saw a faded tattoo on his forearm, a fishing boat. She turned and walked to the kitchen. She ignored the questioning looks from the guards. She worked quickly, her hands sure. She made a simple anchovy and seaweed broth, adding soft tofu and rice. It was a humble fisherman's porridge, a dish of poverty and home, something a mother would make for her son after a long day at sea. When it was done, she carried the steaming bowl back to the office. Jin-woo turned, his eyes questioning, a flicker of annoyance in their depths. She ignored him and walked directly to the prisoner. She held the spoon to his lips. "Eat," she said, her voice soft but firm. He spat at her. The glob landed on her apron. She didn't flinch. She simply wiped it off and held the spoon out again. "Your mother would be ashamed," she whispered in Korean, a phrase she'd practiced with one of the housekeepers. The man's bravado crumbled. His eyes filled with tears as the scent of the soup hit him, a scent tied to a life he had lost, a home he could never see again. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was a devastatingly precise psychological blow. He began to sob, great, racking sounds of a broken man. He told them everything. Rose stepped back, the bowl trembling in her hands. She had used her gift, her one pure thing, as a weapon. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She looked up and met Jin-woo's eyes. He was staring at her, not with anger, but with a look of stunned, absolute awe. The instruments on his desk lay untouched. Later, after the man had been taken away, Jin-woo found her on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. "How did you know that would work?" he asked, his voice quiet behind her. "Everyone is hungry for something," she answered, not turning around. "Even if it's just a memory." He came to stand beside her, the cold night air swirling around them. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of what she had done. "I married you to settle a debt," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I thought you were a liability, a weakness my enemies could exploit." He turned to face her, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, intense, stripped of all pretense. "You are the most dangerous weapon I have, Rose." The final confrontation was not a firefight, but a dinner. Choi Min-jun, believing he had Jin-woo cornered and weakened, agreed to a truce meeting on neutral ground, a private, opulent dining room in a high-end Gangnam restaurant. He arrived with his lieutenants, smug and confident, ready to dictate terms. He saw Rose standing quietly behind Jin-woo's chair and dismissed her with a smirk. The chubby wife, a decorative piece of collateral. The meal was served by the restaurant staff, course after course of impeccably prepared, soulless food. Choi pontificated, outlining his demands, his voice dripping with condescension. Jin-woo listened, his face an impassive mask, his hands resting calmly on the table. Rose remained silent, a statue in the corner of the room. Then came the final course, a special digestif, served in small, elegant porcelain cups. A gift, the waiter explained, from Mr. Kwan's wife, to commemorate the new peace. Choi laughed, picking up his cup. He toasted Jin-woo mockingly. "To your charming wife," he said, and drank it down. Rose watched him, her expression unreadable. She had sourced the ingredients for the digestif herself, through her network of market vendors and kitchen suppliers, a network that was now fiercely loyal to Mama Rose. The main ingredient was a rare, potent root, ground into a fine powder. It was not a poison. It was a fast-acting paralytic, tasteless and odorless. It began subtly. A tremor in Choi's hand as he set the cup down. A slight slur in his speech as he tried to continue his victory speech. He looked at his hands, confused. His men started to notice, their confident expressions turning to alarm. Choi tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. Panic flashed in his eyes as he slumped back into his chair, his body suddenly, terrifyingly useless. He was conscious, aware but utterly helpless. That was the signal. Jinwoo's men, who had been posing as restaurant security, moved in. They were silent, efficient, and utterly ruthless. There was no struggle. Choi's men were disarmed and subdued before they could even process what was happening. Rose had not waited for a rescue. She had not been a pawn in the game. She had set the board, chosen the pieces, and with a single, humble cup, had checkmated a king. When it was over, and Choi was being dragged away, his eyes wide with impotent fury, the room fell silent. Only Jinwoo and Rose remained. The air was thick with the ghost of violence and the lingering scent of the digestive. Jinwoo rose from his chair and walked to her. He didn't look at her with awe or surprise anymore. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time and the last time, all at once. He took her hand, the hand that had measured the powder, the hand that had created the victory. He raised it to his lips, his gaze locked on hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but a gesture of fealty, an acknowledgement. "My lieutenants call you Mama Rose," he said, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room. "They are wrong." He pressed his lips to the back of her hand, a soft, deliberate pressure. "An empire does not call its queen Mama," he straightened, his grip on her hand tightening, not in possession, but in partnership. "They will call you by your rightful name." He didn't need to say what it was. She had paid a price for this victory. The warmth of her kitchen, the innocence of her gift, had been forged into a weapon. She could never go back to being just a cook, a girl who found solace in spices and slow-braised meats. She had chosen this world, this man, this power. He led her from the room, his hand holding hers, their fingers intertwined. They walked out into the main corridor of the restaurant, where his soldiers stood waiting. As they passed, the men bowed their heads. It was a gesture she had seen them give him 100 times. But tonight it was different. Their eyes were on her. They bowed not just to their boss, but to his queen. She had entered his world as a payment, a prisoner in a gilded cage. Now, she walked beside him, a ruler in her own right, the architect of a victory won not with bullets, but with a bowl of soup and a cup of tea. Her throne was not made of gold, but of steel and spice, and from it, she would help him rule.